Welcome to the Free Will, Science, and Religion podcast. I'm Trick Slattery, and I'm here with George Ortega and Jamie Soden. And today we're going to talk about the hedonistic imperative and how it drives our decisions drives us to make the decisions that we make. So, George, what do you say about the hedonistic imperative? What is first explain what it is and tell us a little bit about what it does exactly, what its function is.
Okay, I just want to correct the term a bit. Basically, it's actually called the hedonic imperative.
Okay.
It's really a term I coined when I published. Well, actually, when I was doing my TV show, and it's really a reiteration of the pleasure principle. You know, Freud and other psychologists, other biologists, just basically on the sciences, there's this principle that organisms, not just human beings, seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Okay.
So hedonic means like related to pleasure and pain. So it's relative to this question of whether we have a free will. If we're hardwired to always do or think what we predict. It's not always like a lot of times our predictions are wrong, but what we predict is going to bring us more pleasure, more happiness. Then that in itself, without invoking causality or nature or nurture in a certain sense, although it isn't genetic, I guess, that kind of like just shows how free will is impossible.
And what would you say about people that act altruistically in the sense that what they do is they kind of sacrifice their own happiness for the happiness of another? What would you say? How does that get into this this imperative?
That's a good question. All right, I think a lot of people might, let's say, prefer sensory pleasures, like being comfortable, feeling good, just physically and whatever, just feeling pleasure. Well, people who are very altruistic, people like Mother Teresa and all, what they do is they will. It gives them more pleasure to satisfy their conscience.
Right.
Exactly. So it's really a different form of pleasure, and maybe a higher form of pleasure.
Right. So it's not necessarily, pleasure doesn't necessarily imply that someone is really experiencing joy, for example, but they might be experiencing something, a desire, I guess, would be maybe a better word. So they're desiring to help somebody else out, and it's that desire that we can say is the pleasure. Would that be correct?
Exactly. One other way to see it is like we've got competing motivations or desires. The desire to feel really good at the time, or desire to be good, to do something good. So like whatever motivation or desire is the strongest, our strongest preference is going to be what we do. And again, that's another way. Our strongest preference, always deciding what we do, is another way of understanding why our free will is impossible.
Okay. And Jamie, how about you? Do you ever feel this this imperative to do what is giving you pleasure, and if so, how does it apply to your life, you think?
It applies to, our everyday life. We do things that we feel that benefits us, or what seems to make most sense to us at the time. We do things, like you say, it's hedonic in principle. We go towards things that are necessary to us, or that we feel that's necessary to us.
Right. So it's hedonic principle, not hedonistic.
Right, because hedonism, actually, that's really a misappropriation of the Greek term. I mean, the Greeks, there were some philosophers that they were called the hedonists.
Right.
Basically, they appreciated pleasure. There was nothing really unethical about how they stated it, but then it got reinterpreted in modern lives to kind of to denote, seeking pleasure in irresponsible ways, in ways that are just morally reprehensible or unhealthy.
Yeah, because that was the kind of the question I had, because when I hear the word hedonistic or whatever, or even hedonic, I get the impression of kind of an egoism, kind of doing what is best for you and not necessarily doing what is best for everybody else. So that's why the word kind of concerned me a little. But I do understand that people actually do what they what they desire to do. Like if I was going to jump on a hand grenade, it's because that I actually desire to prevent the hand grenade from killing off the other people. It's something that is within me that I want to happen. So I do understand that. So but it's kind of I'm just trying to make the distinction between that and.
That is an extreme example, though. I mean,
that isn't. Yeah, it's a very extreme example, but I'm just saying, people doing things like a sociopath might do what is most pleasurable to them, but at the same time, that isn't necessarily what's best for society. So I just kind of want to see where the line is.
Exactly, because like with our happiness in general, our seeking happiness, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to seek it in ethical ways or moral ways. So,
of course, yeah. A sociopath will seek it in a way that is suitable for them, but not necessarily beneficial to other people. Like they get off on the pain of others, don't they? Sociopaths.
Right, which is interesting, Jamie, because like something else that the Greeks kind of like developed was this idea. It's very similar to the hedonic imperative that I think I termed kind of like the moral imperative. That basically what a lot of Greek philosophers said is at the time we're doing anything, and that might include being very sadistic, very sociopathic, whatever, we are rationalizing it. We're saying to ourselves, we're doing something good because that person deserved it, because like things aren't fair. We'll say something to, in our minds, convince ourselves that what we're doing is actually the right thing. So that's another imperative. We seem to constantly do that also.
Yeah.
And
would you say things like revenge would be like sociopathic because people feel justified, they feel morally justified in getting vengeance on someone who hurt them or their friends or whatever,
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in regards to how this plays out within the realm of ethics, since we're kind of leaning in that direction there, would you say that understanding the hedonic imperative kind of allows us to work with causality to make people, psychologically want the thing that is ethical. So in other words, we kind of need to play to the hedonic imperative in a way that makes people be ethical or act ethically.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of like a different concern. I mean, I think we're kind of like refuting. We're trying to lead the world away from this free will perspective, this free will belief, because as Jamie was saying, it leads to like our judging others as doing something wrong and then seeking retribution, wanting to punish them because we attribute free will to them, and believe they deserve to be punished. So yeah, I think what we're doing, Trick, is like we're kind of like making it easier, more logical for people to be happy or seek pleasure in moral ways by interpreting reality in the right way, by not attributing blame to other people that they're actually fundamentally innocent.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the right word, what we need to stop wrongdoing, to deter like crime or whatever, the word we need is, I think you would use the word discipline, because I said this the other day to Gary. We won't use retribution in the sense that we'll kill the killer for killing innocent people, but we would certainly lock them up in jail and say, look, if you go and do these things, this is going to be your punishment.
Yeah, and that gets more into the whole deterrence thing.
Yeah.
Why we need to do something to deter people. Especially if they aren't the most rational. So, we're trying to get people to that rational model where they understand that free will is an illusion, and they understand that pretty much no person is more or less deserving than another person of the worst of that they get or the best. So we need to kind of it's more of a balancing act that we're trying to play out here, and when it comes to the hedonic imperative, I cannot get that straight. Hedonistic, hedonic. I think definitely does play into it. It's playing into the psychology of people basically. So
Yeah, again, like if we're always like seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, that's programming. Let's say we use the analogy if we created a robot that could move, and every time it encountered a wall, it made a left turn instead of a right. It encounters an obstacle or wall. It could make a left or a right turn, but we program it to always make a left turn each time it hits that obstacle. It's the same thing. If we're programmed to every time we have a decision about what to do to try to predict what we believe is going to bring us the most happiness, the most pleasure, that's the same kind of programming that would apply to the robot. So just how we see that the robot has no choice but to make a left, we have no choice but to do what we believe is going to bring us more pleasure or happiness.
Right. And like you said, what we mean by happiness doesn't necessarily have to be some blissful state, I guess. It could be some psychological happiness. That's something else, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Just satisfying our conscience.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense there.
Yeah. Well, the reason why you'd make like a sacrifice to save another, like with your grenade example, is because you feel it's the morally right thing to do to, say, protect a child from the frag grenades or whatever, So you'll jump on it and try to absorb some of the explosion, whatever, but you'll get killed in the process, obviously.
Right. So it's not. Yeah. So I mean that's where it gets a little tricky, because it's not necessarily. Obviously, you being dead isn't going to make you the most happiest, but to your own psychology, that was your best option. That was, I guess, the
right.
most...
And you got to realize, Trick. I mean, here in the United States, 80-90% of people believe in a higher power, and I think believe in heaven. So a lot of people are thinking, oh, I'll throw myself on a grenade and do a noble, courageous thing and be rewarded with eternal happiness in heaven.
That's a good point as well. Yeah, if you bring up their whole religion thing, then it's not. The death part isn't as important as the happiness you'll find in heaven as well. So people might be doing that as well. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it would get quite messy though, because most of their body's made of water, so Yeah.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the hedonic imperative. What else would you say on this, George? Is there anything else you have?
Well, yes. I mean, let's talk more about imperatives. We talked about the hedonic imperative. Then, there's kind of like a moral imperative. We're going to do what we at the time believe is right. There's another imperative that's like the reason imperative or the logic imperative. We're not going to do what doesn't seem reasonable. The example I usually use is there's two glasses before us, and we want to empty the contents of a pitcher or something into one of them, and we see that one of them is not going to hold the contents, but the other one will. Our logic will compel us to pour the liquid or the water into the larger glass. So we apply that to everything. If something doesn't make sense, we're kind of hardwired to do what makes sense to us.
Though I see some people that's not as important, and we need to work towards them, towards the hedonic imperative, towards them leading to the reason imperative. In other words, some people reason isn't what gives them the most pleasure. It's other things, faith, for example, or just community or emotions. These are things that give them the pleasure, and that I don't think that necessarily equates to the reason imperative. Though I think the reason imperative is more important. So I'm trying to see how we can work toward using the hedonistic or the hedonic imperative, to lead towards the more reasonable imperative. What do you say about that?
I agree with you. In other words, while our default, I think motivation is generally to be reasonable, a lot of times our emotions will kick in, our desires and all. And actually, this is like what we're up against with the free will question. You know, a lot of philosophers, PhDs, who've been studying this for years, if not decades, their need, their psychological need to believe either that they're in control of things, or that you know, we have this personal morality, whatever they have these personal emotional, I think, needs to see life in a certain way that prevents them, that hijacks or trumps their reasoning. So you're right, Trick. We have to come up with ways to get them to derive more pleasure from understanding that free will is an illusion than from like denying it and subverting their reason.
Exactly. So I'm thinking that the hedonic imperative is probably a stronger imperative than the reason imperative, at least for some people. So that's the way I see it anyway. And we need to get people to move to the reason imperative, and I don't know the best ways to do that personally.
We need to get
more on the best ways.
Yeah, and we need to get more people like on board with this rehabilitation stuff, because on some offenders it can work, you know.
Yeah. Actually, like there was this guy Chris Mooney. He's a science writer. He a couple of years ago or so wrote this book called The Republican Brain, and he also basically the basic thesis. He just went through the literature and just cited all this research that most people think that, like, for example, our political opinions, our opinions about social issues and all, that we form these based on what seems logical and rational. And what all this research has discovered is no, we form our beliefs not based on what makes sense, on the data and all. We base these beliefs on what we need to believe. And he called it the Republican brain because, like, apparently Republican conservatives do this more than liberal Democrats and all. But everybody really does this, and so we have to balance this. In other words, like, part of what we do, I think, has to be to really explain the solid, irrefutable logic of free will being impossible. But we also have to cater to their emotions. In other words, like, again, some of these philosophers, they've written books on this, and they still get the answer wrong. So again, we have to also appeal to their emotional needs to help them, have their reasoning, consider the evidence.
Right, and in some way, I'd say it's probably an uphill battle, because we have all these biases that people have, like confirmation bias, optimism bias, even pessimism bias. So all these different biases bombard people without them even knowing, and we need to move people away from the bias and get them to look at things from more of a observer perspective, where they're looking down on the world and they're just looking at the facts. And that's what I'm not sure how we go about doing.
Realistic, yeah.
Yeah, like Jamie, you're talking about, sometimes we're unfair to people because we blame them because of our free will belief. We have this this bias toward seeking retribution, seeking justice and all. And it's conditioned. It's conditioned, generation after generation. So we have to find ways to help people value fairness and compassion and empathy more than they value, just desserts and revenge and all.
Yeah, it's like people with different mental illnesses, and people just get the wrong impression about some of them. They assume, they're psychotic, they're likely to offend, and not in all cases. This is what I try and tell people, and Trick Slattery knows this, and I sent him some proof about it before. Just some people just blame people for what they think about. It's just
right.
wrong.
And Trick, you're right. This, a perfect example is evolution. I think Darwin proposed it. It was the 1860s, something like that.
Exactly.
And here we are, over 150 years beyond that, and still half of Americans believe in creationism. So some of these beliefs are very tough to shake. Yeah.
They believe in creationism and they deny evolution. So, which is, has mounds and mounds and mounds upon mounds of evidence. It's probably our most strongest scientific finding. So, yeah. So what else? So we went over confirmation bias. We went over biases and the problems with what people just basically having bias and not being able to get to the point of the reason imperative. And we're trying to work out solutions to that. Any other ideas regarding solutions?
Well, again, in politics a lot, here in the United States, Republicans win a lot of elections not because they are right on the issues logically, but because they know they're wrong, or maybe they don't, I don't know. They will appeal to people's emotions. So we basically have to find ways, for example, like instead of telling people don't blame others because they're not really fundamentally responsible, because it's wrong to do that because it doesn't make sense. Our message has to be, listen, when you understand that you and everybody around you doesn't have a free will, that nobody has a free will, then you're going to feel much better not blaming them, because our relationships will improve, and like a lot of times we blame ourselves, so we're going to feel much better. So we have to really find messages that shift them, that basically substitute the kind of pleasure they're having in either blaming or taking credit for stuff, substitute that for a higher pleasure of just enjoying people more, enjoying themselves more, enjoying life more.
Yeah. And I think we can also kind of go into how destructive blaming others is, and how the world itself would be a better place if everybody didn't blame each other, and how that would actually affect them hedonically, I guess, that the world is a better place. Right, Jamie?
Yeah, I agree with that. But one of the barriers is, I think, people's religious faith, because the belief in free will is important to people who believe in God and all this and that and the other. And I understand that it's hard to let go of old tradition and stuff, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge the truth. And it's not their fault. They were indoctrinated with these beliefs. Their families passed on old traditions to them, and then they pass on their traditions to other people. It's like Christmas. People celebrate Christmas every year, and some of them are not even Christians. So
yeah,
yeah,
that definitely. I mean, the whole religion thing is a big obstacle for us, because a lot of people think that God gave them free will and all that stuff. So we need to kind of work around that, and it takes people a long time to change a belief, especially something that's been indoctrinated since they're it's
ingrained into their mind.
Yeah, that's what we have to understand. I mean, it's going to take society years, if not several decades, to really get this, and I think we will. But with the religion, for example, people are going to want to believe in God, and so we actually use the logic that they believe that that's part of their religious belief to basically contradict this notion of free will. For example, if they define God as being all powerful, then it's very easy to make the argument to them, well, listen, according to your belief, if God is all powerful, that means if he doesn't want you to do something, there's no way you're going to do it, and if he wants you to do something, there's no way you're not going to do it. So, basically using the beliefs. And then the other thing is kind of to make them feel good about this, because a lot of times people feel good, oh, I'm going about my day doing what I will, what I want to do. And so, for religious believers, for believers in God, we say to them, listen, when you abandon this free will belief, you'll go around your days basically saying, well, I'm doing all this, I'm doing God's work, I'm doing God's will. And I think for a lot of people that's actually a more positive evaluation of justifying their actions than just doing them because we want to.
Yeah, it's definitely I think a fair stepping stone to the rational imperative that we're looking for. Though I wouldn't say that that has hit the rational imperative, but it's just you have to take small baby steps to get to that point, and I think that might be one of them.
Yeah, you have to make examples to try and simplify it for him. Like, for example, a computer programmer, right, who makes a video game, makes fictional characters with having their individual AI, so they can walk around in like an open world. They have no free will, but they had a creator, So you have to use that example with this God thing. If God created people, with the knowledge that they'll do something, then his creations cannot have free will.
Excellent example, Jamie. For example, let's say we created a robot, right?
Yeah.
And through some magic, because it would have to be magic, 'cause we gave that robot free will, and that robot went out and wreaked havoc, in town, just destroyed stuff. So like, they get the robot, they get us, we're in front of a judge. I mean, like, who do you think the judge is going to punish? The robot or us?
Of course. Yeah.
So absolutely.
Yeah, and that goes kind of into the whole when people who think their God is a punishing God and will send them to hell or anything like that. It's kind of like us creating a robot that has a pain sensor and then programming it to destroy whatever, like your house or something, and then when it does, punishing it for that.
Yeah,
it's an absurdity.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's like smashing a car for malfunctioning. You know what I mean? It's just
right.
And so, like, in terms of like people getting this trick, I mean, like, we're gonna do a lot of the podcasts. We're gonna like reiterate these same points over and over and over because people need to hear this. Sometimes people need to hear this 100 times or 1,000 times before they can overcome their emotional, denial resistance to it.
Yeah. And for me, it's like a big psychological thing. It's made me less angry. I definitely don't get angry hardly ever, So even when people do things that really would normally bother me, I can kind of get by it now because I understand that why it's happening. It's through their causal mechanism, and they couldn't have done otherwise than what they're doing. So. And when people start to realize that, they become more relaxed about things and they don't become immediately angry.
Yeah. People realize if you get angry about certain stuff, right, all it's doing is putting your health at risk.
Absolutely, and we should do episodes basically based on my experience because I feel it too. Like when I see these politicians saying these horrible things, whatever, on TV, before I used to get personally angry at them and at groups of people. Now, I'm very quick to remind myself, oh my God, it's not up to them. So I might still get angry at the universe or God, but that's a lot better than getting angry at people or ourselves.
Yeah, I find that I get more frustrated than angry now. So it's just a frustration for the causal variables that happen. It's like, oh, why did those causal variables have to happen? It's just frustrating. That rather than me being angry over it, because I know it's not anything that could have happened otherwise. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like people end up arguing with for telling them that people are not to blame for their mental disorders and stuff, psychological problems. It doesn't matter whether it's depression, like what me and Felicia have got, or other psychological problems like schizophrenia, bipolar, or whatever it may be. They should not be blamed for an illness that impairs them to the point where they cannot work.
Yeah, and you're even getting into mental illnesses or illnesses that are actually we know of, but even without the illnesses, people aren't to blame in that sense. So we kind of we don't even have to go to the illness part of things. We can just say no. It's no matter what the person does, they had to do that based on their
exactly. Guys, we got less than 30 seconds.
Okay. So how do you want to close this up, George?
Well, I mean, like, I think, let's remind the audience, we're going to be talking more and more about this, coming up with more and more examples of how overcoming the free will belief is going to benefit people personally and the world in general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Trick. Great show.
Great show, guys.
All right. Talk to you soon.